Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. Have you ever heard of the idea of pouring boiling oil on your attacking enemies during a siege from a medieval castle? An almost ubiquitous form of defense in the medieval period. But how about we check it with the sources to see if this actually happened or no? I think we are all somewhat familiar with this idea of boiling oil being poured on attacks as a form of defensive tactics to prevent a castle from falling into the hands of the enemy. And at least from a logical standpoint, it kind of makes sense. I mean, if you throw or pour boiling oil on an enemy soldier as they're trying to climb a ladder, for instance, of course they will be out of action. And the idea gets even further strengthened because of the presence of murder holes in medieval architecture. Holes that indeed appear to allow the pouring on any sorts of liquids onto the enemy. So, is it this ubiquitous castle defense, or is it a myth? Well, as it's often the case, reality is somewhere in the middle. To give you a quick answer or an abstract before we dive into the sources, let's put it this way. We are talking about a half myth. So, did it ever happen? Yes. Was it common or ubiquitous? Absolutely not. It would have been an extremely rare defensive system that was in fact improvised and only done as a last-ditch resort during a siege that was otherwise almost lost. To justify these statements, we're going to jump into the sources, we're going to look at iconography, and we're going to look at medieval art, and in fact mentions all the way back to antiquity. And the reason why I say it's half a myth is because it's oil and the idea of it being ubiquitous that make it a myth. The reality is that even though oil was used, it was the least common substance or liquid that would be thrown on enemies during a siege. But there were other substances that were in fact used, once again, on occasions. Let me substantiate that. Let's begin with actual medieval iconography. So here we are on manuscript and miniatures, and if you search specifically for sieges or siege, you will get 288 miniatures from the medieval period. And on these miniatures, as you look at the actual art from the Middle Ages, you'll notice that there is a plethora of defensive systems and strategies that have been used to try and defeat the assailants. We'll find, of course, crossbows, archers, slingers, hand-to-hand combat once the assailants or the enemy is reaching the top of the walls or the machicolations. We will see several objects dropped onto the enemies, possibly rocks or stones. Here again, more rocks and stones, and someone casually being stabbed to death and falling to his death. I mean, this one is very video game-like. So, as you'll see, you'll be hard-pressed to find images that actually show us a representation of a liquid, not even just oil, but a liquid being cast onto people. This doesn't mean that it was never done. You will find the occasional one, but it does suggest that it must have been, as I was mentioning, a last resort and a very rare occurrence during sieges. Moreover, during those times of desperations, all sorts of substances would have been used: boiling water, heated sand, quicklime or calcium oxide, pitch, tar, rocks and debris. Alright, that makes sense, also considering the expense, the price of a commodity such as oil, and the large quantities that you would need in order to make it into a systematic battlement defense for castles, in a widespread sense. But what about the sources? Do we have mentions of the usage of such implements during actual sieges from the period? When we look at the sources to answer this question, you do have to consider that what we're doing is a little bit of patchwork, as there were many other details that probably appeared more interesting or salient to the people that wrote these chronicles, rather than what kind of substances were thrown on the enemies. Before jumping into actual medieval sources, we should go back to classical antiquity to find one of the earliest mentions of the idea of using oil during a siege. In 67 AD, we have the siege of the castle of Iotapata in the Near East. The Roman commander Josephus Flavius writes in his Jewish Wars that boiling oil was indeed cast over the attacking Romans as a last resort due to the desperation of the besieged. In 332 BC, we have another mention, but this time is during the siege of Tyre, where the besieged were actually throwing fervent sand on the attacking troops led by Alexander the Great. And we are told how the sand will go through the armor, burning their eyes and their skin. By the way this is explained, it should be considered once again as a last-ditch resort before the fall of the town. Thus, beside the occasional sporadic mentions in classical antiquity, the only other case in which we are told about some sort of flammable substance used against their enemies in warfare is during naval battles, and we are talking about Greek fire. Yes, and we can find a sort of connection to the Middle Ages because Greek fire was used during the Crusades, and it was in fact one of the leading reasons as to why there were several battles, and naval battles specifically, where the Christians defeated the Saracens. Because of it, Greek fire being a sort of substance that we still don't know what it is, that was so flammable that not only it would ignite spontaneously upon contact, but it would be impossible to be quenched, at least with water. Having established that the usage of boiling oil during sieges is rare, what about tar and pitch? Now we're getting somewhere. When it comes to the actual medieval period, Jan Długos, a Polish priest and chronicler who was alive in the 15th century, mentions twice the usage of pitch during sieges in his Annals or Chronicles of the famous Kingdom of Poland. And I will share a few others, but we do have to keep in mind that from a linguistic perspective, we do have to be careful how we interpret. This is a matter of interpretation. Maybe he meant pitch or wood pitch, but it's also possible that it was a matter of quicklime or simply rocks. Therefore, it is mentioned, but we're not 100% sure, and it depends on what translation you use. Now let's focus a little more on tar and pitch. Now whenever we discuss the possible usage of any form of implements for a defensive system, we have to consider a few things: availability, production cost, logistics of deployment, and ratio it with the overall effectiveness of such implement when compared to others more available materials. Possibly the first thing we should ask is the following: did medieval people have access to tar and pitch? And the answer to that is yes, they did. In fact, tar is extremely ancient, probably more than you think. For those who don't know, tar is a thick, black, sticky liquid composed of hydrocarbons and free carbon formed by the destructive distillation of various organic substances. It can be derived from all sorts, including wood, coal, petroleum, or peat. Additionally, similar tar-like materials can be obtained from fossil-based hydrocarbons like crude oil. When coal undergoes cooking to produce coal tar emerges as a secondary byproduct of this process. The earliest documented references to the production of wood tar are found in the writings of Theophrastus from 371 to 287 BC and Pliny the Elder, 24 to 79 AD. The fundamental techniques of distillations have seen minimal change since antiquity and are broadly categorized into autothermic and allothermic methods. The first, autothermic, uses rudimentary tar kilns, a bit like we see in video games such as Conan or Valheim, where no physical barrier separates the central wood being processed from the surrounding burning fuel. In contrast, allothermic methods, which emerged in Slavic regions by the 7th century, involved more advanced systems, such as the stacked pot arrangement and progressively sophisticated kilns documented from the 13th century onward.